Activity 29. Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class.
A geyser is the result of underground water under the combined conditions of high temperatures and increased pressure beneath the surface of the earth. Now, temperature rises about maybe 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 60 feet under the Earth's surface. And we know that pressure also increases with depth, water that seeps down in cracks and fissures. So when the water reaches very hot rocks in the Earth's interior, it becomes heated to the temperature of, let's say, 290 degrees. Okay then. Water under pressure can remain liquid at temperatures above the normal boiling point, but in a geyser, the weight of the water nearer the surface exerts so much pressure on the deeper water that the water at the bottom of the geyser reaches much higher temperatures than the water at the top. And as the deep water becomes hotter, and consequently lighter, it suddenly rises to the surface and shoots out of the ground in the form of steam and hot water. In turn, the explosion agitates all of the water in the geyser reservoir. And what do you think happens then? More explosions. So immediately afterward, the water goes back into the underground reservoir. It starts to heat up again, and the whole process repeats itself. So, in order to function, then, a geyser must have a source of heat, a reservoir where water can be stored until the temperature rises to an unstable point, an opening through which the hot water and steam can escape, and underground channels for resupplying water after an eruption. Now, favorable conditions for geysers exist in regions of geologically recent volcanic activity, especially in areas of more than average precipitation. For the most part, geysers are located in 3 regions of the world: New Zealand, Iceland, and the Yellowstone Park area of the United States. I'd say that the most famous geyser in the world is Old Faithful in Yellowstone. It erupts every hour, rising to a height of 125 to 170 feet and expelling more than 10,000 gallons of hot water during each eruption. Old Faithful earned its name because, unlike most geysers, it's never failed to erupt on schedule even once in 80 years of observation.
Activity 34. Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
People call it a bear, but the koala is really a marsupial. So it's much more like a kangaroo than it is like a bear. Here's what I mean. First, the koala has a gestation period of only about 35 days before it's born. Then a tiny pink furless creature about 19 millimeters long makes its way from the birth canal into the mother's pouch, where it attaches itself to one of 2 nipples. So it stays in the pouch to complete its development, and 6 to 7 months later, it pokes its head out and explores a short distance from the mother, jumping back into the pouch until it reaches 8 months when it's too big to fit. And for another 4 months, it rides on the mother's back or hangs from her stomach until it finally becomes independent at about 1 year old. By then, it's about the same size as a teddy bear and looks remarkably like one, with a furry coat, rounded ears, and a large nose to support its keen senses of smell and hearing. Native to Australia, the koala lives in trees and is a skillful climber. It sleeps in the branches during the day, and at night it combs the trees for its favourite meal, eucalyptus leaves.
Activity 37. Now that you have read the explanation of human migration patterns in the reading, listen to part of a lecture on a similar topic.
Okay, today I want to talk to you about a hypothesis that explains where humans might have evolved and how they might have migrated around the world. It's an alternative hypothesis to the replacement hypothesis that you read about earlier. It's called the multi-regional hypothesis, but I've also heard it referred to as the continuity hypothesis. Now, according to the scientists who support this view, modern humans spread throughout Eurasia about 1 million years ago, and regional populations retained some unique anatomical features for hundreds of thousands of years. but they also exchanged some inherited traits with neighboring populations when they mated with them. And we call this exchange of traits gene flow. So, through this gene flow, certain characteristics that we consider crucial to modern mankind were inherited, as, for example, an increase in brain size with an accompanying change in the skull. And this gene flow resulted in the evolution of the early humans whose remains are found throughout Europe and Asia as well as Africa. Now, scientists who support this theory contend that the populations that migrated were linked by gene flow, so that the features that all people have in common spread throughout the world. The relatively slight differences among modern people would have been caused by hundreds of thousands of years of regional evolution. But actually, researchers who support the continuity hypothesis tend to focus on the genetic similarities among human populations worldwide, not the differences. We're really amazingly similar as a species. And the fossils of archaic and modern humans in some regions do suggest a continuous evolution in regional traits, like the cheekbone structure, for example, which is further evidence that modern humans may have evolved over a broad area among multiple groups of human ancestors.
Activity 38. Now that you have read the explanation of population in the reading, listen to part of a lecture on a similar topic.
Well, it's certainly true that Malthus has had an enormous impact on the study of population. And, in fact, many of his predictions about limitations on population appeared to be true for a time. But right now, the major debate in economic population theory is between a group who believes that population growths reached a critical mass and can no longer be controlled through the events and forces that Malthus predicted. And on the other side of the debate, a group that views birth control as part of a larger demographic transition. Here's what I mean. Demographic transition is a model in which large populations move from stage 1, with very high birth and death rates like Malthus predicted, to stage 2, in which the birth rates remain high but the death rates begin to decline, mostly because of progress in food production, sanitation methods, and medical treatment, all of these modern advances that couldn't have been predicted when Malthus was developing his theory. So the population grows very rapidly in stage 2. Okay, in stage 3, population continues to increase because although the birth rate decreases, the death rate also decreases. So fewer people are born, but they tend to live longer. Now, stage 4 is the point at which the population increases very slowly, or it may even start to decline because both the birth rate and death rates are even lower than in the previous stage. So we see this in Japan, Europe, and North America. In fact, in Europe, we see something that appears to be a stage 5. In Europe, the decline in the birth rate has dropped to a level of 1.7, which is below the 2.0 replacement level for a couple. So, unless immigration rates increase, Europe's population may be an indication of future demographics for other industrialized regions.
Activity 39. Now that you have read the explanation of crop circles in the reading, listen to part of a lecture on a similar topic.
Okay, let's look at the scientific data on crop circles. Serious scientists have catalogued photographs of crop circles that are strikingly similar to computer fractals, that is, geometric patterns that are smaller than traditional geometry, and even mirror processes in quantum physics. And Professor Gerald Hawkins has used principles of Euclidean geometry to prove 4 theorems that can be derived from the relationships of elements in crop circles, as well as an additional 5th theorem, from which he derived the other 4. In spite of a challenge to the scientific community, no one has been able to create that mysterious 5th theorem, although Euclid alluded to it. So it was a shock when its equilateral version appeared in a barley field in Britain. Another interesting scientific theory also originates in ancient writing. The Egyptians referred to geometry as frozen music, and, in fact, modern investigations of sound vibration confirm that sound frequencies can create circles at low frequencies and more complex forms at higher frequencies. And direct observation of the crop circles also provides some interesting data along those lines. In most of the cases, the stems of the grain are not broken, but bent. The biophysical evidence seems to indicate that the plant's nodes have become hugely extended. The seed embryos have been distorted, and the crystalline structure appears to have been reorganized. Nevertheless, the plants do not appear to be damaged and will continue to mature and ripen. Further laboratory investigations suggest that the plants may have been subjected to a very high-intensity heat in a short burst, similar to the results of infrasound, which is measured at below 20 Hz. In experiments with infrasound, water in plant stems has come to a boil in less than 1 nanosecond. This would be consistent with the reports by witnesses that the process takes place within seconds, and that there appears to be steam within the newly created crop circles. In addition, soil samples from inside the circles themselves display characteristic crystalline structures that would suggest their having been subjected to temperatures of almost 1,500 degrees Celsius.
Activity 40. Now that you have read the explanation of strategic business alliances in the reading, listen to part of a lecture on a similar topic.
Okay, now I want you to think about two companies that have historically been in competition for the package delivery service in the United States. Well, the first to come to mind has to be the U.S. Postal Service, right? But now think fast delivery. For that, Federal Express is at the top of the list. But instead of viewing their relationship as totally competitive, these two companies struck an unprecedented strategic alliance several years ago. The U.S. Postal Service agreed to let Federal Express place package collection boxes at thousands of post offices throughout the United States, which was great for FedEx because they achieved an immediate national presence. But in exchange, FedEx allowed the Postal Service to buy unused space on the Federal Express airplanes in order to carry first class, priority, and most importantly, express mail envelopes and packages, increasing the speed with which they could deliver the mail without purchasing aircraft. Moreover, by sharing websites to track their deliveries, both companies have been able to create a larger internet presence. So, why would these companies be willing to help each other? Probably the most commonly espoused explanation is that they both are battling fax, email, and other emerging messaging technologies, and their combined resources may result in survival and success for both of them against a common threat. And that fits in nicely with the whole concept of strategic alliances. But besides that, many countries, New Zealand, Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands, to name only a few, these countries have ended the special government status that postal services have traditionally enjoyed, with all the benefits, including tax advantages and subsidies. So, it may be that the U.S. Postal Service is trying to find alternatives to show progress before privatization ends its chance of survival. And Federal Express might be positioning itself to be the really big winner if the Postal Service goes up on the auction block at some time in the future. In other words, the real purpose of strategic alliances may be to serve competing interests in the long term.
Model Test 2. Listening Section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will respond to conversations and lectures. This is the short format for the listening section. On the short format, you will respond to 2 conversations and 4 lectures. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. You will hear each conversation or lecture 1 time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and OK to go to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. You have 25 to 30 minutes to answer all of the questions. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations and lectures.
Listening 1. Professor's office.
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor James, do you have a minute?
Sure, come on in. What can I do for you?
Well, I did pretty well on the midterm,
You sure did. One of the best grades, as I recall.
but I missed a question, and I'd appreciate it if you could help me understand what I did wrong. I have the test right here, and I just can't figure it out.
Okay, fire away.
It's question 7, the one on biotic provinces and biomes.
Oh, that one. Quite a few people missed it. I was thinking that we should go over it again in class. But anyway, let's look at your answer.
Thanks. Here's the thing. I said that a biotic province was a region with similar life, but with boundaries that prevent plants and animals from spreading to other regions. So an animal, for example, a mammal, it may have a genetic ancestor in common with another mammal. But a biome's a similar environment, an ecosystem really, like a desert or a tropical rainforest. So in the case of a biome, well, the similar climate causes the plants and animals to evolve, to adapt to the climate, and that's why they look alike.
That's good. Very good, as far as you went. But there's a second part to the question. Look, right here. Include an explanation of convergent and divergent evolution. So I was looking for a more complete answer. Next time, be sure to include both parts of a question, when there are two parts, like this one. Do you know how to explain convergent and divergent evolution?
I think so. Isn't it like when a group of plants or animals, when they're separated by mountains or a large body of water, then subpopulations evolve from a common ancestor and they have similar characteristics, but their development diverges because of the separation. So that's why we call it divergent evolution.
Right. Even when the habitat's similar, if they're separated, then they diverge. How about convergent evolution then?
Well, that would be a situation where a similar environment, a habitat, it may cause plants and animals to evolve in order to adapt to the conditions. So a species that isn't really related can evolve with similar characteristics because it can look like a species in another geographic region because of adaptation. And that would be convergent evolution?
Right again. So temperature and rainfall, proximity to water, latitude and longitude all combine to determine the climate. And if we know the climate of an area, then we can actually predict what kind of life will inhabit it.
Okay. And I really did know that. I just didn't put it down. To tell the truth, I didn't see the second part, not until you pointed it out to me.
That's what I thought. Well, Jerry, it's a good idea to double-check all the questions on a test, not just my test, any test, to make sure you've answered each part of the question completely. Otherwise, you won't get full credit.
I see that. Well, live and learn.
Jerry, you're one of my best students.
Thanks. I really like biology. In fact, I'm thinking of majoring in it.
Good. That means you'll be in some of my upper-level classes.
And I'll be watching out for those two-part questions on your exams.
And all the rest of your exams. I'll be honest with you, my questions usually have two parts, so the students will have an insight into the grading system, and a lot of professors do that. In an essay question, it's difficult to know what to include and how much to write. Just read the question carefully and be sure to include all the parts. There may be 3 or 4 in some essay questions. This is the way that the professor helps you organize your answer. I'm giving my students a hint about what I'm looking for by including several parts to the question, but if you miss one of the parts, then it lowers your score.
That makes sense. I think I was just trying to finish within the time limit and I didn't read as carefully as I should have. On the final, I'll spend more time reading the questions before I start to answer them.
Good plan.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? 2. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
Thanks. Here's the thing. I said that a biotic province was a region with similar life, but with boundaries that prevent plants and animals from spreading to other regions.
Why does the man say this?
Thanks. Here's the thing.
Three. What did the man do wrong? Four. According to the student, what is divergent evolution? Five. What will Jerry probably do on the next test?
Listening 2. Art History Class.
Listen to part of a discussion in an art history class.
Sorry about the tests. I don't have them finished. They just took longer to grade than I thought they would. So I'll have them for you next time. Okay then, let's begin our discussion of the ballet. If you read the chapter in your text, you already know that in 1489, a performance that was something like a dinner theater was organized to celebrate the marriage of the Duke of Milan, and a dance representing Jason and the Argonauts was performed just before the roasted lamb was served. By the way, it's interesting that the dance was called an entree, and that name has been retained for courses and meals. Anyway, about the same time, outdoor entertainment, parades and equestrian events, they were becoming more popular, and we have evidence that they were referred to as horse ballets.
So the horse ballet, was it the first time the term ballet was used?
Right. The actual term in Italian was balletti, which meant a dance done in figures, and it was characterized by the arrangement of the performers in various patterns. Actually, the balletti were staged versions of the social dances that were popular at court, and the steps, the basic movements, they were walking, swaying, and turning. So they combined in a variety of sequences, each of which was named so that they could be referred to in the directions for individual dances. In fact, specific instructions for the placement of the dancer's feet probably provided the first record of the 5 positions of classical ballet. Question?
Sorry, I'm trying to get clear on the dancers. Could you explain what the book means about court dancing? And, I'm not saying this very well.
I think I know where you're going. You see, the directions that were written down were intended as a reference for social dancing, but they were important in the history of ballet because the theatrical dances or entertainments that preceded ballet were not performed by professional dancers. Members of the court danced for the entertainment of society, and in general, the performances were in the central halls of castles and palaces, with the audience seated in galleries above, so that the floor figures could be seen when the people looked down. But back to your question. Because of the limitations of the performers and the arrangement of the staging, the best way to impress the audience was to keep the steps simple enough for the amateur dancers, but the geometrical patterns had to be intricate and fresh, so the spectators would go away pleased because they'd seen something new.
Oh, I get it now. That makes sense, too, because everyone would be looking down at the dancers.
Exactly. Now, to continue that thought for a moment, by the middle of the 16th century, variety shows were being presented on a grand scale in northern Italy. They included both indoor and outdoor entertainment, and most people called them spettacoli. And France had begun to make a significant contribution to the dance form that evolved into modern ballet. But to be precise, It was Catherine de' Medici who used dance as part of her court entertainments and is credited with the use of the term ballet. In 1573, I think it was 1573, anyway, she organized a huge celebration to welcome the ambassadors from Poland who had arrived to offer their country's throne to her son Henri. So she called it the Polish Ballet, and the production was staged on a landing at the top of a grand staircase. 16 ladies, and these would not have been dancers, just members of court, so they represented the 16 provinces of France, and they performed a choreographed dance with a variety of floor figures. Afterward, the audience joined in court dances, similar to the ballroom dancing that evolved later. So that's a long answer to your original question.
Now, I have a question.
Okay.
You said that the Polish ballet was the first ballet, but I thought the book said the first ballet was Queen Louise's ballet.
Good question. Well, I said the Polish ballet was the first use of the term ballet for a dance performance, but Queen Louise's ballet is generally considered the first modern ballet. As you'll remember from the book, the ballet was performed before 10,000 guests, and it was 5 hours long. When I was doing the research for this lecture, I saw several references to the time, so I know that this is accurate. But I kept thinking, no one would watch a ballet for 5 hours. But it must be correct. I can only assume that other activities were going on simultaneously, like a banquet and conversation, don't you think? Anyway, what makes Queen Louise's ballet so unique, besides the length, and why it's the first modern ballet, is that it was connected by a storyline, or in technical terms, it's called dramatic cohesion. Each scene was related to the tales of Circe, a Greek enchantress, who used her powers to battle with man and the gods. The triumph of good, portrayed by Jupiter over evil, portrayed by Circe, was told in a, let's call it a unified production.
6. What is the discussion mainly about? Seven. Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
So I'll have them for you next time. Okay then, let's begin our discussion of the ballet.
Why does the professor say this?
Okay then.
Eight. According to the professor, what does the term balletti mean? Nine. How did the early choreographers accommodate the abilities of amateur performers? Ten. Why does the professor mention that he checked several references about the length of Queen Louise's ballet? (11) What can be inferred about the professor?
Listening 3. Linguistics class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a linguistics class.
What comes to mind when I say the word grammar?
That's easy. English class and lots of rules.
Memorizing parts of speech, like nouns and verbs.
Diagramming sentences.
Well, yes, that's fairly typical, but today we're going to look at grammar from the point of view of the linguist. And to do that, we really have to consider 3 distinct grammars for every language. The first grammar is referred to as a mental grammar, and that's what a speaker of a language knows often implicitly about the grammar of that language. This has also been called linguistic competence, and from that term, competence grammar has become popular. I like to think of it of mental or competence grammar. I like to think of it as an incredibly complex system that allows a speaker to produce language that other speakers can understand. It includes the sounds, the vocabulary, the order of words and sentences, and even the appropriateness of a topic or a word in a particular social situation. And what's so amazing is that most of us carry this knowledge around in our heads and use it without much reflection. One way to clarify mental or competence grammar is to ask a friend a question about a sentence. Your friend probably won't know why it's correct, but that friend will know if it's correct. So, one of the features of mental or competence grammar is this incredible sense of correctness and the ability to hear something that sounds odd in a language. Haven't you had the experience of hearing a sentence and it stood out to you? It just wasn't quite right. For native speakers, we can call this ability native intuition. But even language learners who've achieved a high level of competence in a second language will be able to give similar intuitive responses even if they can't explain the rules. So, that's mental grammar or competence grammar. Okay then, that brings us to the second type of grammar, and this is what linguists are most concerned about. This is descriptive grammar, which is a description of what the speakers know intuitively about a language. Linguists try to discover the underlying rules of mental or competence grammar and describe them objectively. So descriptive grammar is a model of competence grammar, and as such, it has to be based on the best effort of a linguist, and consequently subject to criticism and even disagreement from other linguists. Because no matter how skilled a linguist is, describing grammar is an enormous task. In the first place, the knowledge is incredibly vast and complex. In the second place, the language itself is changing even while it's being described. And finally, the same data can be organized in different but equally correct ways in order to arrive at generalizations. And the ultimate goal of a descriptive grammar is to formulate generalizations about a language that accurately reflect the mental rules that speakers have in their heads. But getting back to what most people think of as grammar, the grammar that we may have learned in school, that's very different from either competence grammar or descriptive grammar because the rules aren't meant to describe language at all. They're meant to prescribe and judge language as good or bad. And this kind of grammar is called, not surprisingly, prescriptive grammar because of its judgmental perspective. Again, to contrast prescriptive grammar with descriptive grammar, just think of descriptive generalizations as accepting the language that a speaker uses in an effort to describe it and recognizing that there may be several dialects that are used by various groups of speakers and that any one speaker will probably choose to use different language depending on the formality, for example, of the situation. On the other hand, prescriptive rules are rigid and subject to enforcement. Prescriptivists want to make all speakers conform to one standard in all situations, and that tends to be a very formal level of language all the time. Now, which of these types of grammar do you think you were learning in school when you had to memorize parts of speech and rules and diagram sentences?
Sounds like prescriptive grammar to me.
Precisely. But how did prescriptive rules get to be accepted, at least in the schools? And probably even more important, why are so many of these rules disregarded even by well-educated speakers in normal situations?
Did you say disregarded?
I did. Some of you may recall that during the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, Latin was considered the perfect language and was used by the educated classes. The argument for the perfection of Latin was reinforced by the fact that Latin had become a written language, and consequently, Latin had stopped changing in the normal ways that spoken languages do. So the rules were also fixed, and for many writers of English during that period, the rules of Latin were held as a standard for all languages, including English. But the problem was that English had a different origin and very different constructions. For example, how many times have you heard the prescriptive rule, never end a sentence with a preposition? This is a Latin rule, but it doesn't apply to English. So it sounds very formal and even strange when this Latin rule is enforced. Now, how many of you would say, what are we waiting for? I think most of us would prefer it to, for what are we waiting? But as you see, this breaks the rule, the Latin rule, that is.
So we're really learning Latin rules in English classes. No wonder I was confused. But wouldn't you think that, well, that things would change? I mean, Latin hasn't been recognized as a world language for a long time.
You're right, but the reason that prescriptive rules survive is the school system. Teachers promote the prescriptive grammar as the standard for the school and, consequently, for the educated class. And good language is a requisite for social mobility, even when it's very dissimilar to the mental grammar or the descriptive grammar of a language.
12. What is the discussion mainly about? (13) How does the professor make his point about native intuition? (14) What are two key problems for descriptive grammar? (15) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
But how did prescriptive rules get to be accepted, at least in the schools? And probably even more important, why are so many of these rules disregarded even by well-educated speakers in normal situations?
Did you say disregarded?
Why does the student say this?
Did you say disregarded?
(16) According to the professor, why were Latin rules used for English grammar? (17) Why does the professor discuss the rule to avoid ending a sentence with a preposition?
Listening 4. College Campus.
Listen to part of a conversation on campus between two students.
I didn't see you at the International Talent Show.
No time for that kind of thing.
You mean you don't belong to the ISA?
The ISA?
International Student Association.
Oh, no. I don't belong to any clubs.
But this isn't like a regular club.
How so?
Well, we have a house. You know, the brick house on Fraternity Row.
You live there, right?
Yeah. I moved in last year. It's really inexpensive because we take care of the house ourselves and we cook our own meals.
That sounds like it would take a lot of time.
Not really. There's a list of chores posted every week, and you can choose something you like to do. So I usually put my name down for yard work. I like being outside, so it's fun for me.
But you have to cook too, right?
Okay, it's like this. 20 of us live there, so every night 2 of the guys cook and 2 of the guys clean up. So you only have to cook about once a week and clean up once.
What about breakfast and lunch?
Oh, well, you're on your own for that. But the dinners are just fantastic. It's like eating in a different ethnic restaurant every night. You know, because the guys are from different countries.
Well, that sounds good.
And it costs about half what it did to live in the dorm. But really, I'm doing it because it's a great experience living with people from so many different countries. My best friend in the house is from Korea. My roommate's from Brazil. And I've got friends from, well, just about everywhere.
But you don't have to live in the house to belong to the club.
No. There are about 100 members in the International Student Association. Only guys live in the house. But there are a lot of women in the association.
I wish I had time to do it. It really sounds interesting.
You've got to relax sometimes. Anyway, we meet at the house the first Friday of the month from 7 to 10. We have a buffet dinner, and after that, we have a short meeting. That's when we plan our activities, like the talent show and picnics and dances. Then a lot of the people stay for music and a party, but some people leave after the meeting.
So it's only a couple hours a month?
Right. Listen, why don't you come over next Friday for the meeting, as my guest, I mean. You have to eat anyway, and if you have a good time, you can think about joining.
Next Friday? Well, I don't know. I usually study on Friday night, but I could take a break. Sure, I'll come over, but I might have to leave early.
Great.
18. What is the purpose of this conversation? "19. What does the man imply about the house where he is living? "20. How does the man feel about the International Student Association? "21. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
Then a lot of the people stay for music and a party, but some people leave after the meeting.
So it's only a couple hours a month?
What does the woman mean when she says this?
So it's only a couple hours a month?
"22. What does the woman agree to do?
Listening 5. Zoology class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a zoology class. The professor is discussing coral reefs.
Every ecosystem on Earth is unique, but the coral reef is perhaps the most unusual of all because it's the only ecosystem made by and made of animals. All coral reefs are constructed by coral polyps, which are generally small, about the size of this pencil eraser. But the structures themselves are, well, enormous. Astronauts have been able to identify the Great Barrier Reef in Australia from space. Can you believe that? And the diversity of species in large coral reefs is second only to the rainforest habitats. In fact, we estimate that for every species we've identified on a coral reef, there are probably 100 times that number that remain to be classified and studied. But how do these little polyps build such impressive reefs? Well, hard corals secrete a shell of calcium carbonate around their bodies. The polyp isn't hard, you see, but the shell is. And these shells are the material that forms a coral reef. So a coral reef is just a colony, millions and millions of coral animals whose shells are connected. And reproduction is really the basis for the construction of a large reef. You see, as each polyp matures, it converts the calcium and other minerals in ocean water to a hard limestone exoskeleton called a corallite. And this is fascinating. Although the polyps themselves don't appreciably increase in size, they continue to build new shells periodically, connecting them with partitions. Now, coral can reproduce sexually through an activity called mass spawning. During one night in the spring when the moon's full, coral polyps release egg bundles that contain both eggs and sperm. Most polyps have both male and female reproductive cells. The egg bundles are round, about half the size of marbles, I'd say. They're brightly colored in orange or red or pink, and they float up to the surface to form a thick layer of, think of them as rather fragrant beads. So with the water so saturated with them, predators will only be able to devour a small number compared with the huge number that will survive and break open. The sperm cells swim away to fertilize the eggs from another bundle. So, once fertilized, the little egg begins to mature from a coral larva to a planulae, which can swim for a few hours, days, or even a few weeks. Ultimately, it locates a hard surface on which to attach itself and from which it will not move for the rest of its life except for the movement involved in the process of building a new, neighboring shell as it continues to mature. But actually, sexual reproduction isn't the way that coral reefs are really constructed. When a polyp matures on the site it's selected, the habitat is identified as being conducive to reef building. So the mature polyp doesn't just grow bigger, it actually replicates itself in a process called budding. After the genetic material is duplicated, then the polyp divides itself in half, and each half becomes a completely mature polyp. This budding process repeats itself, eventually producing thousands of asexually budded coral polyps connected by a tissue that grows over the limestone shells between the polyps. So, as you can imagine, budding will produce a large number of individual polyps, but they'll all have exactly the same genetic code as the first polyp. And this creates the beginning of a coral reef, but without the diversity that eventually populates the habitat. Wherever a coral reef's constructed, abundant sea life congregates. In fact, it's been estimated that about 25% of all ocean species can be found within the coral reefs. Now, most coral polyps eat plankton, single-celled microscopic organisms that float or swim very slowly in the ocean water in their habitat. But a coral reef has such a high concentration of polyps, they can't rely solely on plankton to survive. So coral polyps have developed a symbiotic relationship with a single-celled algae called zooxanthellae. Remember that to qualify as symbiotic, a relationship must be mutually beneficial. So the zooxanthellae produces food for the coral through the byproducts of photosynthesis, and the coral provides a safe home for the zooxanthellae because it's hidden from predators that inhabit the coral reef. Every species of coral grows at a different rate, some as much as 6 inches a year. But faster-growing colonies are more prone to breaking apart, either from their own weight or from the continuous force of the ocean waves. Some species tend to grow more slowly, but they may live as long as 1,000 years. Even so, only the top portion of any reef is actually alive and growing, and the lower structure is comprised of the skeletal remains. That's limestone corallite from coral that has died. And what I find incredibly interesting about coral reefs is that each is a unique structure. But of course, scientists need to classify, and so there's a classification system for coral reefs. A fringing reef grows around islands and the shorelines of continents and extends out from the shore. In order to flourish, fringing reefs must have clean water, lots of sunshine, and a moderately high concentration of salt. Some good examples of fringing reefs can be found around the Hawaiian Islands. Oh yes, these are the most common and also the most recently formed class of coral reefs. Here's a drawing of a fringing reef. I think this is actually one of the Hawaiian reefs. Now, barrier reefs, they're found further from shore, and they're usually separated from the shoreline by a shallow body of water, maybe a lagoon. As in the case of the Great Barrier Reef off the shore of Australia, the body of water can be miles wide, so the reef's miles away from the shoreline. And there may actually be a collection of coral reefs fused together. This is a drawing of a reef in the Great Barrier Chain. As I recall, there are about 25 or maybe even more individual coral reefs connected to form the Great Barrier Reef. As a general rule, barrier reefs are larger and older than fringing reefs. But the oldest class of coral reef is the atoll, which is a ring-shaped reef with a lagoon in the middle and deep water surrounding the ring. These are scattered throughout the South Pacific, kind of like oasis settlements in the desert, and they abound with a diversity of sea life. This is one of the South Pacific atolls. So, as we reflect on everything we've said about coral, we know that it's a relatively simple organism with a body ending in a mouth and tentacles. It reproduces both sexually and asexually by budding, and it survives by forming a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae. But none of this is very extraordinary. What's unique about coral in the animal kingdom is its ability to construct a variety of reefs, creating habitats that are absolutely unlike any others on Earth.
23. According to the professor, How do coral reefs grow? (24) Why are so many egg bundles released during mass spawning? (25) According to the professor, what is budding? (26) What is the relationship between zooxanthellae and coral polyps? (27) Which of the following reefs is probably an atoll? (28) In the lecture, the professor explains coral reefs. Indicate whether each of the following is a true statement about coral reefs. Click in the correct box for each phrase.
Listening 6. Business class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a business class.
Industry analysts report that multinational food companies are trying to use the same types of strategies that automobile and electronics manufacturers have found to be successful in the global marketplace. The problem is that general rules for products that tend to be traditional for national or even regional tastes, these products are very difficult to identify, and sales aren't easy to project. But the companies that tend to do best are those that are the most responsive to local tastes. And they spend development dollars on taste testing in the local markets before they formulate the final product. Can anyone recall any examples from the case studies in the text? Sandy?
McDonald's Big Mac has more mustard in the special sauce in Paris than it does in New York.
Because?
Because taste tests verified that people in the United States liked sweeter condiments than people did in France. In fact, I think the sugar content for export foods in general usually has to be modified when American products are taste tested overseas.
Right you are. Probably the company that's adapted most to local tastes is Nestle. Can you believe that they produce more than 200 slightly different blends of Nescafé for export to different countries? Amazing, but true. But sometimes taste is less a problem of ingredients and more a matter of the way a food product looks or feels. One case study that comes to mind is the one about the soft cookies that just don't sell as well in England as crisp cookies. So you can see that taste extends way beyond just flavor. It's really a combination of flavor preferences and local expectations. Look, here's another example of accommodation that had more to do with the expectation for a process than the flavor of the product. In this case study, it was cake. Remember when Betty Crocker cake mixes were introduced in England, they weren't accepted because the English homemaker felt more comfortable with convenience foods that required more than water to prepare them. Go figure. But that was the problem uncovered by extensive market research. So when the mix was reformulated without an egg, and the preparation included adding an egg with the water before mixing it, well, Betty Crocker cake mixes became very popular in England. Any other examples come to mind? They don't have to be from the case studies in the book.
How about serving sizes?
Go on.
Well, soft drinks for one. Just compare the serving sizes in the United States and many foreign markets where soft drinks are sold. The cans in foreign markets are much smaller because consumers expect it. But in the United States, well, supersizing is probably a consideration when a foreign company is trying to crack the American market.
That's a great example. So the taste can be acceptable, but the packaging has to compare favorably with the competing brands and the public's expectations.
Yeah, but that makes products more expensive, doesn't it? I mean, because you can't standardize the product or the packaging, so that would make it more costly to produce, wouldn't it?
Right you are, Chris. In fact, you've really gone to the heart of the issue. a compromise has to occur between the requirement that products be adapted to please the taste and the expectations of local consumers and the pressure to standardize products for maximum cost effectiveness. Now, let's complicate that even further. Even the experts don't agree on the importance of how far to go in adapting products for local markets. A few years ago, Ted Levitt, he's the editor of the Harvard Business Review, Levitt predicted what he called a pluralization of consumption. What he means is that, at least in some areas, tastes are likely to converge, which makes sense when you think about the increased opportunities for travel and sampling of foods, as well as the continued global marketing efforts by multinational corporations. So, logically, it's smarter to simply identify the areas in which tastes are most likely to be the same and concentrate efforts on those food products. But there's also the issue of global marketing. How about the potential to create taste? I mean, selling the image that surrounds using a product. If consumers want to associate themselves with that image, won't they develop a taste for the product that does that for them? For example, there's some evidence that the popularity of products seen in movies and television spills into the foreign marketplace. This subtle brand association with the movie or the celebrities in it translates into high-dollar deals for certain brands to be visibly displayed in widely distributed films.
Oh, right. I was reading about that. It was in a couple of the case studies. The bottle, a can, or a package appears as part of the character's persona. And if it's a character that audiences choose to identify with, then the taste for the product may follow, or at least that's what the marketing experts are betting on.
And that includes foreign audiences. Anyone drink Starbucks coffee? Well, Starbucks began as a regional coffee in Seattle, Washington, and made the global leap in 2000, opening shops in China, a huge market, surely, but also a traditionally tea-drinking society. So what's the attraction? Starbucks is marketing to the cosmopolitan consumer, the young trendy set looking for a modern image as well as a different taste. Still, there have been some real surprises in the multinational dinner party. No one has really figured out why the Italians, Germans, and British love Kraft's Philadelphia cream cheese, and the Greeks simply don't buy it. And why did Perrier, a mineral water from France, why did Perrier take America by storm while other imported mineral waters didn't? In short, success in the food export industry is probably a combination of the real taste, the flavor of the product, with some adaptation for the local markets, the satisfaction of certain expectations for the preparation and packaging, and the taste for the product created by images in the global marketing plan. Add to this mix the potential for a short shelf life or even perishable products, and, well, you have a very challenging problem for the multinational food industry.
29. What is the discussion mainly about? (30) How does the professor organize the lecture? (31) Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
Any other examples come to mind? They don't have to be from the case studies in the book.
How about serving sizes?
Why does the student say this?
How about serving sizes?
(32) What technique does the professor use to encourage student discussion? (33) What did Ted Levitt mean by the pluralization of consumption? (34) What does the professor say about television and movie companies? Model Test 2. Speaking Section. The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 6 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a conversation, a talk, or a lecture. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but most of the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time, but the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. The time for the speaking section is about 20 minutes. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare your answer and how much time you have to record it.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Explain how birthdays are celebrated in your country. Use specific examples and details in your explanation.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some students would rather write a paper than take a test. Other students would rather take a test instead of writing a paper. Which option do you prefer and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A student is discussing the university's health insurance policy with the foreign student advisor. Read the policy in the college schedule printed on page 195. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to the foreign student advisor. He is explaining the policy and expressing his opinion about it.
I think it's very important for you to know that this policy wasn't instituted in order to increase fees for international students. In fact, the university doesn't make a profit from the sale of health insurance. The problem is that health care costs in this country are so high that it could be financially disastrous for the family of an international student who needed more than just a simple visit to the doctor's office. A trip to the emergency room at the hospital could cost thousands of dollars without health insurance. Most families abroad just don't realize how costly it is. As for foreign health insurance providers, well, it was just too difficult to validate their coverage for medical services, and the local doctors and hospitals simply stopped accepting them. So, to be sure that our students are protected, we're offering low-cost health insurance through the school.
The foreign student advisor expresses his opinion of the policy for health insurance. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and listen to a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about Antarctica, printed on page 196. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a geography class. The professor is talking about Antarctica.
With the increasing pressure to replace raw materials that are being consumed in other parts of the world, Antarctica and the waters offshore could become a stage for international conflict in the future. During the 18th and 19th centuries, hunters decimated huge populations of whales and seals, and the race to reach the South Pole resulted in national claims by explorers from a variety of countries, which finally resulted in the partitioning of pie-shaped sectors radiating away from the center at the pole. So, today, several claims overlap, and only one sector remains unclaimed. Virtually all of these claims are covered by an ice sheet about 2 miles thick. But the question is, what's beneath the ice? Scientific experiments indicate that proteins, fuels, and minerals exist in abundance, and that means that in spite of the difficulties and challenges involved in the exploitation of these natural resources, the countries with claims haven't demonstrated an intention to relinquish their stake in the area. While resources are available in more convenient sites, the remote areas in Antarctica appear to be relatively safe from exploitation. In addition, as the reading passage suggests, global self-interest may engender international cooperation in this crucial environmental system.
Explain why many countries have staked claims in Antarctica and why national interests have not been pursued.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and her friend.
I need to earn some extra money. My budget's just out of control.
I hear you. I had the same problem last semester.
So what'd you do?
I got a job at the cafeteria. I don't really like the work, but the good thing is that you get free meals.
Really? Are they hiring?
I don't know, but I could ask. The pay isn't great, though. See, the meals are the thing.
Oh, still, that would cut down on the grocery bill.
Yeah. Or you know what? You could rent that extra room in your apartment. I'll bet you could get $250 a month, at least.
I've been thinking about that. It would help with the rent and the utilities, and I wouldn't have to work so I could use my time for my classes. But I keep thinking, what if my roommate doesn't pay on time, or what if there's a lot of noise?
Well, you'd have to have a deposit and a contract, something in writing so you could keep the deposit if there were problems, and you could break the contract if it didn't work out.
Describe the woman's problem and the 2 suggestions that her friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the woman should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a sociology class. The professor is discussing the criteria for using older research references.
Well, first of all, you have to understand that there's no hard and fast rule for deciding when a research reference is too old. But that doesn't help you much. So I'll try to give you a couple of guidelines, and then you'll just have to use good judgment. Okay, let's just say for our purposes that the research is 30 years old. Then the next thing to think about is whether any changes have occurred in society to call the data into question. For example, in a study that looks at diet, we know logically that many changes have occurred in eating patterns over the past 30 years. So this study would probably be out of date. But a study of, say, language development may be okay because the way that babies learn their native language hasn't changed much in the same period of time. So what I'm saying is, the date is less important than the potential for change. Okay, then the second criteria to consider is whether the citation is a finding or an opinion. If you have a study that indicates, for example, that college students are drinking more, that's a finding. But if you have a statement by the researcher that drinking is the most serious problem on campus, then you have an opinion. And opinions are accurate over the years as long as they're attributed to the person and the dates cited. But the finding for an older study may be too old. In that case, it's probably better to use a more recent study.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the 2 criteria for using an older research reference presented by the professor.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 2, Writing Section.
First, read the passage on page 199 and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
Philosopher John Searle has challenged the validity of the Turing test because it's premised on behavior rather than on thought. To prove his argument, he suggested a paradox, which he refers to as the Chinese room. If a monolingual English-speaking person receives questions on a computer terminal from a Chinese person in another room, naturally, the English-speaking person won't understand the questions. However, if there's a large reference that can be accessed, and if the reference is detailed and comprehensible, then the English speaker could conceivably break the code. For example, if a sequence of Chinese characters are received, the reference could indicate which sequence of Chinese characters would be expected in response. In other words, the behavior would be correct, although the English speaker wouldn't be thinking at a level that included meaning. The person would be manipulating symbols without understanding them. Or, as Searle suggests, the person would be acting intelligent without being intelligent, which is exactly what a computer could be programmed to do. Therefore, at least theoretically, a computer could be designed with complex input that would allow it to provide adequate behavioral output without being aware of what it's doing. If so, then it could pass the Turing test. But the test itself would be meaningless because it doesn't really answer the most basic question about artificial intelligence, which is, can the computer think?
Model Test 2. Example answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1. A birthday.
In my country, birthdays are celebrated every year, but the most important birthday for a young girl is the quinceañera, the birthday when she's 15. This is celebrated with a church service. The girl wears a white dress, kind of like a wedding dress, and several attendants accompany her to the altar where the priest talks with her about becoming an adult woman. After the service, the whole family celebrates with friends, and there's music and dancing and food. Traditionally, only relatives and close friends are invited to the church service, but many more people attend the party afterward. In the old days, the ceremony presented the girl to society for marriage proposals, but now she's considered the appropriate age to begin dating.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2. Course requirements.
I prefer to write a paper instead of taking a test, because I know exactly what the topic is when I'm researching a paper, but there are a large number of possibilities for questions on a test, and that makes it much more difficult to prepare for. Besides, in my experience, some teachers aren't very straightforward about their tests, and even though I've studied and understand the subject, well, sometimes the questions that you'd expect to see aren't on the test, and some obscure information is tested instead. But probably the most important reason for my preference is that I get very nervous when I'm taking a test, and that can affect my performance. Writing a paper doesn't cause me the same level of anxiety.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3. Health insurance.
The foreign student advisor agrees with the policy that requires international students to purchase health insurance from the university at registration. He assures students that the university isn't trying to increase fees for international students by doing this. He explains that health care is very expensive. For example, a visit to the emergency room can be a financial burden to a family who doesn't have medical insurance. He says that most families of international students don't expect the cost to be so excessive. And the reason that the university doesn't allow students to substitute other healthcare providers is because the local medical community has had problems with validation for health insurance plans from abroad and now refuses to accept them. So, in order to protect the students, the school doesn't make any exceptions to the policy.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Antarctica.
Many countries have staked claims in Antarctica because the natural resources in other areas are being depleted, and research indicates that minerals, fuels, and even some sources of protein are probably under the ice in large quantities. So the implication is that as raw materials are exploited in areas that are relatively easy to reach, nations will think about taking advantage of their claims. For the time being, the location and climate have discouraged exploitation, and so have the treaties that protect the environment and encourage scientists to collaborate. It's also worth mentioning that Antarctica's vitally important to the balance that's maintained in the environment worldwide. So, in addition to all the difficulties that would have to be overcome to take advantage of the resources in their claims, individual nations also recognize the danger to the global environment and, at least for now, they're not pursuing their national interests.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Extra money.
The woman needs additional income to meet her expenses, so her friend suggests that she get a job at the cafeteria. Even though the salary isn't very high, the free meals are helpful. He isn't sure whether there's a job available, but he agrees to find out. He also recommends that she rent the second bedroom in her apartment for a minimum of $250 a month, which would subsidize the rent and utilities. The problem she points out is that roommates can be disruptive and sometimes they aren't financially responsible. But she'd have more time to study if she didn't have to work, and her friend reminds her that she could require an agreement in writing, along with a deposit. Okay, in my opinion, she should try to get a job either in the cafeteria or someplace else on campus, because if she lives alone, she can maintain a quiet environment for study, and she won't have to worry about a contract that could be difficult to enforce.
Example answer for Integrated Speaking Question 6. Research references.
According to the lecturer, there are two major criteria for using an older research reference. First, she mentions, and I'm quoting here, the potential for change. For example, research on diet may be too old after 30 years because many changes have occurred in dietary practices during that time. But research on language development may be okay because fewer changes have taken place in language acquisition in the same number of years. The other criteria requires that you first identify the research as a conclusion or an opinion because, in general, a conclusion may be outdated when a newer study is published, but an opinion credited to a person with the date of the opinion in the citation, that's correct over time. In other words, there's no exact number of years to decide whether a reference is acceptable, so the date isn't as significant as the criteria. So, an older study can be used if changes in the research haven't taken place, or if the results are worded as opinions with the date cited.
Review, listening section. Problems 15 to 18. Conversation.
Listen to a conversation on campus between two students.
Wait up. I need to ask you about something.
Oh, hi, Jack.
Hi. Listen, I was just wondering whether you understood what Professor Carson was saying about the review session next Monday.
Sure. Why?
Well, the way I get it, it's optional.
Right. He said if we didn't have any questions, we should just use the time to study on our own.
Okay, that's what I thought. Maybe I'll just skip it then.
Well, it's up to you. But the thing is, sometimes at a review session, someone else will ask a question, and, the way the professor explains it, it's really helpful. I mean, to figure out what he wants on the test.
Oh, I didn't think about it that way, but it makes sense. So you're going to go then?
Absolutely. I've had a couple other classes with Carson, and the review sessions always helped get me organized for the test.
Oh.
And if you've missed any of the lectures, he usually has extra handouts from all the classes, so...
Well, I haven't missed any of the sessions.
Me neither, but I'm still going to be there. Look, if it's like the other review sessions, the first hour he's going to go over the main points for each class, kind of like an outline of the course. Then from 5:30 to 6:30, he'll take questions. That's the best part. And the last half hour, he'll stay for individual conferences with people who need extra help. I usually don't stay for that.
Okay, so we just show up at the regular time and place for class?
Or not, if you decide to study on your own.
Right. But don't you think he'll notice who's there?
He said he wasn't going to take attendance.
Yeah, but still.
It's a fairly large class.
But if he's grading your final and he remembers you were at the review, it might make a difference.
Maybe. I think the important thing is just to study really hard and do your best. But the review sessions help me study. I think they're really good.
Okay, thanks. I guess I'll go too.
So I'll see you there.
Yeah, I think I'd better go.
1. Why does the man want to talk with the woman? Two. Why does the woman think that the review session will be helpful? Three. Why does the man decide to go to the review session? Four. Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the following question.
He said he wasn't going to take attendance.
Yeah, but still.
It's a fairly large class.
Why does the man say this?
Yeah, but still.
Review, listening section, problems 19 to 24. Lecture.
Listen to part of a lecture in a zoology class.
As you know from the textbook, mimicry isn't limited to insects, but it's most common among them, and by mimicry I'm referring to the likeness between two insects that aren't closely related but look very much alike. The insects that engage in mimicry are usually very brightly colored. One of the insects, the one that's characterized by an unpleasant taste, a bad smell, a sting or bite, that insect's called the model. The mimic looks like the model but doesn't share the characteristic that protects the model from predators. But of course, the predators associate the color pattern or some other trait with the unpleasant characteristic and leave both insects alone. Henry Bates was one of the first naturalists who noticed that some butterflies that closely resemble each other were actually unrelated. So mimicry, in which one species copies another, is called Batesian mimicry. I have some lab specimens of a few common mimics in the cases here in the front of the room, and I want you to have a chance to look at them before the end of the class. There's a day-flying moth with brown and white and yellow markings. And this moth's the model because it has a very unpleasant taste and tends to be avoided by moth eaters. But you'll notice that the swallow-tailed butterfly mounted beside it has very similar coloration. And actually, the swallowtail doesn't have the unpleasant taste at all. Another example is the monarch butterfly, which is probably more familiar to you since they pass through this area when they're migrating. But you may not know that they have a very nasty taste because I seriously doubt that any of you have eaten one. But for the predators who do eat butterflies, this orange and black pattern on the monarch's a warning signal not to sample it. So the viceroy butterfly here is a mimic. Same type of coloring, but no nasty taste. Nevertheless, the viceroy isn't bothered by predators either because it's mistaken for the monarch. So, how does a predator know that the day-flying moth and the monarch aren't good to eat? Well, a bird only has to eat one to start avoiding them all, models and mimics. A stinging bumblebee is another model insect. The sting's painful and occasionally even fatal for predators, so there are a large number of mimics. For example, there's a beetle that mimics bumblebees by beating its wings to make noise. And the astonishing thing is that it's able to do this at the same rate as the bumblebee, so exactly the same buzzing sounds created. I don't have a specimen of that beetle, but I do have a specimen of the hoverfly, which is a mimic of the honeybee. And it makes a similar buzzing sound too. When you compare the bee with the fly, you'll notice that the honeybee has two sets of wings, and the hoverfly has only one set of wings. But as you can imagine, the noise and the more or less similar body and color will keep most predators from approaching closely enough to count the wings. Some insects without stingers have body parts that mimic the sharp stinger of wasps or bees. Although the hawk moth is harmless, it has a bundle of hairs that protrudes from the rear of its body. The actual purpose of these hairs is to spread scent, but to predators, the bundle mimics a stinger closely enough to keep them away, especially if the hawk moth is moving in a threatening way as if it were about to sting. There's the hawk moth here in the case, and to me at least, it doesn't look that much like the wasp mounted beside it. But remember, when you're looking at a specimen, it's stationary, and in nature, the movement's also part of the mimicry. Oh, here's a specimen of an ant, and this is interesting. Another naturalist, Fritz Müller, hypothesized that similarity among a large number of species could help protect all of them. Here's what he meant. After a few battles with a stinging or biting ant, especially when the entire colony comes to the aid of the ant being attacked, a predator will learn to avoid ants, even those that don't sting or bite, because they all look alike and the predator associates the bad experience with the group. And by extension, the predator will also avoid insects that mimic ants, like harmless beetles and spiders. Look at this. I have a drawing of a specimen of a stinging ant, beside a specimen of a brownish spider, and the front legs of the spider are mounted so they look more like antennae because that's just what the spider does to mimic an ant. That way it appears to have 6 legs like an ant instead of 8 like a spider. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want you to take this opportunity to look at the specimen cases here in the front of the room. I'll be available for questions if you have them. How about forming 2 lines on either side of the cases so more of you can see at the same time?
5. What is the lecture mainly about? 6. How does the professor organize the lecture? 7. According to the lecture, what are some characteristics of a model? 8. How does the professor explain Batesian mimicry? 9. In the lecture, the professor explains Fritz Müller's hypothesis. Indicate whether each of the following supports the hypothesis. Click in the correct box for each choice. (10) Indicate whether each insect below refers to a model or a mimic. Click in the correct box for each phrase.
Quiz. Listening section.
This is a quiz for the listening section of the Next Generation TOEFL. This section tests your ability to understand campus conversations and academic lectures. During the quiz, you will listen to one conversation and one lecture. You will hear each conversation or lecture one time and respond to 12 questions about them. You may take notes while you listen. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Once you begin, do not pause the audio.
Questions 1 to 4. Conversation.
Listen to a conversation on campus between a professor and a student.
Hi, Professor Taylor.
Hi, Jack.
I was hoping that I could talk with you for a few minutes. It's about the test.
Oh, okay.
Well, I've never taken an open book test, and I just don't know what to expect. Does that mean I can use my book during the test as a reference?
Exactly. And you can use your notes in the handouts, too.
Really?
Yes, but Jack, since you've never taken an open book test, I should warn you, it isn't as easy as it seems.
Because
you don't have enough time to look up every answer and still finish the test.
Oh.
That's the mistake that most students make. You see, the purpose of an open book test is to allow you to look up a detail or make a citation. But the students who are looking up every answer spend too much time on the first few questions, and then they have to leave some of the questions at the end blank.
So it's important to pace yourself.
It is. The test's 1 hour long, and there are 20 questions, so you have to be working on question 10 in half an hour.
Right. That's clear enough. So, how do I prepare for an open book test?
Well, the first thing to do is to organize your notes into subject categories, so you can refer easily to topics that might appear in the test questions. And then study your book, just like you would for any other test. Well, some people mark passages in the book with flags to make it easier to locate certain facts. But other than that, just prepare for a test like you usually do.
Right. Professor Taylor, could I ask you, why are you making this test open book? I mean, we have to study for it like always, so I hope you don't mind that I asked. I'm just curious.
I don't mind at all, Jack. I think an open book test provides an opportunity for real learning. Too many of my students used to memorize small facts for a test and then forget all about the broad concepts. I want you to study the concepts so you'll leave my class with a general perspective that you won't forget.
Wow, I can relate to that.
Most people can. But the way I see it, this is a psychology class, not a memory class.
Well, thanks for taking the time to explain everything, Dr. Taylor.
You're welcome, Jack. See you next week, then.
Okay, have a nice weekend.
You too.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? 2. Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the following question.
Yes, but Jack, since you've never taken an open book test, I should warn you, it isn't as easy as it seems.
Because
you don't have enough time to look up every answer and still finish the test.
Why does the student say this?
Because
3. How should Jack prepare for the test? 4. Why does the professor give open book tests?
5 through 14. Lecture.
Listen to part of a lecture in an economics class. The professor is talking about supply-side economics.
The fundamental concept in supply-side economics is that tax cuts will spur economic growth because these tax cuts will allow entrepreneurs to invest their tax savings, thereby creating more jobs and profits, which ultimately allow the entrepreneur and the additional employees to pay more taxes even though the rates are lower. Let's go through that again, step by step. First, taxes are lowered. Then, business owners use their tax savings to hire more workers. This increases profits, so the business owner pays more taxes at a lower rate. And in addition, the newly hired workers all pay taxes as well. So there's more income flowing into the government through taxes. Historically, in the United States, several presidents have championed tax cuts to get the economy moving. Although this top-down economic theory is more popular among Republicans, who have traditionally been aligned with business interests, in 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a Democratic president, also used tax cuts to improve economic conditions. He probably wouldn't qualify as a true supply-sider, but he did understand and capitalize on the basic concept. But it's perhaps Ronald Reagan who's most closely associated with supply-side economics, so much so that his policies in the 1980s were referred to as Reaganomics. During his term of office, Reagan cut taxes, but actually, the huge increases in spending, especially for the military budget, caused supply-siders to debate with their conservative cousins. You see, conservative and supply-side are not the same thing. Traditional conservative economists insist that tax cuts should be accompanied by fiscal responsibility, that is, spending cuts by government. But supply-side economists aren't concerned with spending. They rely on tax cuts to do the job, period. Back to the supply-side policies under Reagan. Well, the supply-siders believed that the economic growth resulting from tax cuts would be so great and the total increase in taxes so high that the United States economy would grow beyond its deficit spending. When this didn't happen, some economists distanced themselves from the label supply side while advocating tax cuts with greater attention to spending. Even Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate and an influential member of the Chicago School of Economics, Even Friedman's now pointing out that the problem is how to hold down government spending, which accounts for about half of the national income. But he still looks to tax cuts as a solution. So, a more recent problem for supply-siders, in addition to the fiscal responsibility issue, is that corporate business tends to move their investment and jobs overseas, which critics say eventually will lead to high unemployment in the United States. But Friedman insists that by moving jobs abroad, incomes and dollars are created that, sooner or later, will be used to purchase goods that are made in the United States and produce jobs in the United States. It's supply-side economics with a global perspective. In fact, conservatives and supply-siders alike argue that progress in the American economy has been made from technological changes and increased productivity, producing different goods or more goods with fewer workers. Dr. Barry Asmus cites the example of the millions of tons of copper wire that had to be produced for us to communicate by telephone across country. Now, a few satellites will do the job. Clearly, the people who were employed in the copper wire industry suffered unemployment when the change in technology occurred. Or another example, in the case of manufacturing, 30 years ago, a General Electric plant required 3,000 workers to produce one dishwasher every minute. Now, the same plant needs 300 people to produce one dishwasher every 6 seconds. So you might focus on the fact that many workers will be without jobs making dishwashers. But what do you suppose supply-siders would say? Think this through. They'd counter with the argument that the dishwasher will be cheaper as a result of the increased productivity. So more people can buy dishwashers and still have some money left. Again, Asmus reasons that if the consumers spend money on more goods, they create jobs because workers are needed to produce the goods they buy. If they invest their money, they also create more jobs by supporting the economy. So, some people do lose jobs because of technology, productivity, and the shift of manufacturing overseas, and only 70% find better paying jobs when they transition to another job. Yes, that's true, and it's a personally painful transition for those involved. But the argument by supply-siders and many conservatives as well is that this is temporary unemployment, and the important word here is temporary. So the temporary unemployment occurs in the process of shifting people not just from one job to another, but from one segment of the economy to another. To use an analogy, it would be like the shift from farming to manufacturing that's occurred worldwide as better methods allowed fewer farmers to produce food and resulted in the movement of farmers from the country to the cities where they became employed in manufacturing. And now there's a shift from manufacturing to technology, which, if supply-siders and conservative economists are to be believed, will result in an even higher standard of living in the United States and globally. But of course, the success of the United States within the global economy will largely depend on a favorable balance of trade, how much we can produce in this country in the new segments of the economy, and how much we can sell abroad.
5. What is the lecture mainly about? Six. How does the professor organize the lecture? Seven. According to the lecturer, what did Kennedy and Reagan have in common? Eight. What would Milton Friedman most likely say about moving a manufacturing plant from the United States to a site abroad? Nine. According to Barry Asmus, What are two key ways that consumers contribute to the creation of new jobs? (10) How does the professor explain the shift from manufacturing to technology? (11) Why does the professor mention the General Electric plant? (12) Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the following question.
Now, the same plant needs 300 people to produce one dishwasher every 6 seconds. So you might focus on the fact that many workers will be without jobs making dishwashers. But what do you suppose supply-siders would say? Think this through.
Why does the professor say this?
Think this through.
(13) In the lecture, the professor explains supply-side economics. Indicate whether each of the following strategies supports the theory. (14) Put the following events in the correct order.
Review, speaking section. Problem 25, example question.
Where would you like to study in the United States?
Problem 25, example answer.
I'd like to study at a university in Washington, D.C. because I have family in the area. And it'd be nice to have them close by so I could visit them on holidays and in case I need advice or help. I've been to Washington several times, and I like it there. It's an international city with restaurants and stores where I can buy food and other things from my country while I'm living abroad. And Washington's an exciting place. I've gone on several tours, but I still have many places on my list of sights to see. Also, there are trains to New York and Florida, so I can take advantage of my free time to see other cities. As for the universities, there are several excellent schools in Washington, and I'd probably be accepted at one of them.
Problem 26, example question.
Some students live in dormitories on campus. Other students live in apartments off campus. Which living situation do you think is better, and why?
Problem 26, example answer.
A lot of my friends live off campus, but I think that living in a dormitory is a better situation, especially for the first year at a new college. Dormitories are structured to provide opportunities for interaction and for making friends. As a foreign student, it would be an advantage to be in a dormitory to practice English with other residents and to find study groups in the dormitory. And dorm students have less responsibility for meals, laundry, and cleaning, because there are meal plans and services available as part of the fees. Besides, there's only one check to write, so the bookkeeping, it's a minimal. And the dormitory offers an ideal location near the library and all the recreational facilities and the classroom buildings.
Problem 27, talk.
Now listen to a student who is expressing an opinion about the proposal.
I understand that a branch campus on the city's west side would be convenient for students who live near the proposed site, and it might attract more local students, but I oppose the plan because it will redirect funds from the main campus where several classroom buildings need repair, Hanover Hall for one. And a lot of the equipment in the chemistry and physics labs should be replaced. In my lab classes, we don't do some of the experiments because we don't have enough equipment. And we need more teachers on the main campus. I'd like to see the branch campus funding allocated for teachers' salaries in order to decrease the student-teacher ratios. Most of the freshman classes are huge, and there's very little interaction with professors. A branch campus would be a good addition, but not until some of the problems on the main campus have been taken care of.
Problem 27, example question.
The man expresses his opinion of the proposal in the announcement. Report his opinion and explain the reasons he gives for having that opinion.
Problem 27, example answer.
The man concedes that the branch campus might be advantageous for students living close to the new location, but he's concerned that the funding for a branch campus will affect funding on main campus for important capital improvements such as classroom buildings that are in need of repair. And equipment in the science labs is getting old, so it needs to be replaced. And he also points out that more teachers are needed for the main campus in order to reduce student-teacher ratios, which would improve the quality of teaching and the amount of interaction in classes. So the man feels that more attention should be given to the main campus, and funding should be directed to improve the main campus before a branch campus is considered.
Problem 28, lecture.
Now listen to a lecture on the same topic.
English uses a system of about a dozen word endings to express grammatical meaning. The ing for present time, s for possession and plurality, and the ed for the past, to mention only a few. But how and when do children learn them? Well, in a classic study by Burko in the 1950s, investigators, they elicited a series of forms that required the target endings. For example, a picture was shown of a bird, and the investigator identified it by saying, "This is a wug." Then the children were shown two similar birds to elicit the sentence, "There are two," and if the children completed the sentence by saying wugs, well, then it was inferred that they had learned the S ending. Okay. Essential to that study was the use of nonsense words like wug, since the manipulation of the endings could have been supported by words that the children had already heard. In any case, charts were developed to demonstrate the gradual nature of grammatical acquisition. And the performance by children from 18 months to 4 years confirmed the basic theory of child language, that the gradual reduction of grammatical errors, that these are evidence of language acquisition. Problem 28, example question.
Describe the WUG experiment and explain why the results supported the basic theory of child language acquisition.
Problem 28, example answer.
In English, there are several important word endings that express grammatical relationships. For example, the ed ending signals that the speaker is talking about the past, and the s ending means more than one when it's used at the end of a noun. So when children learn English, they make errors in these endings, but they gradually refine their use until they master them. In the WUG experiment, Burko created nonsense words to get children to use endings. So the researchers could follow their development. It was important not to use real words because the children might have been influenced by a word they'd heard before. So this experiment provided data about the time it takes and the age when endings are learned. It supported the basic theory of child language that sorting out grammatical errors is a feature of the speech of 4-year-olds and a stage in language acquisition.
Problem 29, conversation.
Did your scholarship check come yet?
Yeah, it came last week. Didn't yours?
No, that's a problem. And everything's due at the same time. Tuition, my dorm fee, and let's not forget about books. I need about $400 just for books.
Well, do you have any money left from last semester? In your checking account, I mean?
Some, but not nearly enough. The check probably won't be here until the end of the month, and I won't get paid at work for 2 more weeks. I don't know what I'm going to do.
How about your credit card? Could you use that?
Maybe, but I'm afraid I'll get the credit card bill before I get the scholarship check, and then I'll be in worse trouble because of, the interest rate for the credit card on top of everything else.
I see your point. Still, the check might come before the credit card bill. You might have to gamble, unless...
I'm listening.
Well, unless you take out a student loan, a short-term loan. They have them set up at the student credit union. Isn't that where you have your checking account?
Mm-hmm.
So you could take out a short-term loan and pay it off on the day that you get your check. It wouldn't cost that much for interest because it would probably be only a few weeks. That's what I'd do.
Problem 29, example question.
Describe the woman's budgeting problem and the 2 suggestions that the man makes. What do you think the woman should do and why?
Problem 29, example answer.
The woman doesn't have enough money for her expenses. She has to pay tuition and her dorm fees due at the same time. Besides that, she needs to buy books. So the problem's everything has to be paid now, and she won't get her scholarship check till the end of the month. And she won't get her paycheck for 2 weeks. The man suggests that she use her credit card because she won't have to pay it off until the end of the month. But the problem is the interest would be substantial if the scholarship check's delayed. The other idea, to take out a student loan, that seems better because the loan could be paid off on the day the check arrives instead of a fixed date, and it wouldn't cost much to get a short-term loan at the student credit union. So, I support applying for a student loan.
Problem 30, lecture.
2 types of irrigation methods that are used worldwide are mentioned in your textbook. Flood irrigation. That's been a method in use since ancient times, and we still use it today where water's cheap. Basically, canals connect a water supply like a river or a reservoir to the fields, where ditches are constructed with valves that allow farmers to siphon water from the canal, sending it down through the ditches. So that way the field can be totally flooded, or smaller narrow ditches along the rows can be filled with water to irrigate the crop. But this method does have quite a few disadvantages. Like I said, it's contingent upon cheap water because it isn't very efficient and the flooding isn't easy to control. I mean, the rows closer to the canal usually receive much more water, and of course, if the field isn't flat, then the water won't be evenly distributed. Not to mention the cost of building canals and ditches and maintaining the system. So let's consider the alternative, the sprinkler system. In this method of irrigation, it's easier to control the water and more efficient since the water is directed only on the plants. But in hot climates, some of the water can evaporate in the air. Still, the main problem with sprinklers is the expense for installation and maintenance because there's a very complicated pipe system, and that usually involves a lot more repair and even replacement of parts. And, of course, we have to factor in the labor costs in feasibility studies for sprinklers.
Problem 30, example question.
Using examples from the lecture, describe 2 general types of irrigation systems. Then explain the disadvantages of each type.
Problem 30, example answered.
2 methods of irrigation were discussed in the lecture. First, flood irrigation. It involves the release of water into canals and drainage ditches that flow into the fields. The disadvantages of the flood method, well, it isn't very efficient since more water is used in flooding than the crops actually need, and also it isn't easy to control. Another problem is the initial expense for the construction of the canals and the connecting ditches as well as maintenance. And besides that, if the fields aren't flat, the water it isn't distributed evenly. The second method's sprinkler irrigation, which uses less water and provides better control, but there's some evaporation and the pipe system's complicated and can be expensive to install and maintain. So there's usually a lot more labor cost because the equipment must be repaired and replaced more often than a canal system.
Quiz. Speaking section.
This is a quiz for the speaking section of the Next Generation TOEFL. This section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic context. During the quiz, you will respond to 6 speaking questions. You may take notes as you listen. You may use your notes to answer the questions. The reading passages and the questions are printed in the book, but most of the directions will be spoken. Once you begin, do not pause the audio.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
If you were asked to choose one movie that has influenced your thinking, which one would you choose? Why? What was especially impressive about the movie? Use specific reasons and details to explain your choice.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some people think that teachers should be evaluated by the performance of their students on standardized tests at the end of the term. Other people maintain that teachers should be judged by their own performance in the classroom, and not by the scores that their students achieve on tests. Which approach do you think is better, and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A meeting is planned to explain the residence requirements for in-state tuition. Read the policy in the college catalog printed on page 251. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to a student who is speaking at the meeting. He is expressing his opinion about the policy.
Well, I agree with most of the policy, but what I don't understand is why I have to use my parents' address as my permanent address. This is my 3rd year in a dorm on campus, and I've gone to school every summer, so I've lived in this state for 3 consecutive years. I don't pay state taxes because I don't earn enough as a full-time student to pay taxes, but I don't receive support from my parents either. I have a small grant and a student loan that I'm responsible for, and I plan to live and work in this state after I graduate, so I think students like me should be eligible for a waiver.
The student expresses his opinion of the policy for in-state tuition. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and listen to a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about communication with primates, printed on page 252. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a zoology class. The professor is talking about a primate experiment.
Let me tell you about an experiment that didn't turn out quite like the researcher had expected. Dr. Sue Samage Rumbo had been trying to train a chimpanzee to use a keyboard adapted with symbols, but no luck. What is interesting about the experiment is that the chimpanzee's adopted son, Kanzi, also a bonobo chimpanzee, well, Kanzi had been observing the lessons and had acquired a rather impressive vocabulary. After that, Kanzi was not given structured training, but he was taught language while walking through the forest or in other informal settings with his trainers. By 6 years of age, Kanzi had acquired a vocabulary of more than 200 words and was able to form sentences by combining words with gestures or with other words. So the question is this: should we proceed by trying to teach language to primates in a classroom environment? Or should we simply live with them and interact informally like we do with beginning learners of language in our own species? I tend to side with those who elect to support language acquisition in natural settings.
Explain the importance of the Kanzi experiment in the context of research on primate communication.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and her friend.
Did you decide to take Johnson's class?
Yeah, I'm going to work it out somehow. Yesterday, I walked from the chemistry lab to Hamilton Hall. That's where Johnson's class is.
And?
And it took me 20 minutes.
Uh-oh. You only have 15 minutes between classes, so that means you'll be 5 minutes late. Listen, why don't you buy a bike? I'm sure you could cut at least 5 minutes off your time if you took the bike trail.
I thought about that, but then I'd have to get a license and I'd have to find somewhere to store it at night. I thought it might be a hassle.
Oh, it's not so bad. I have a bike. The license is only $10, and I just park my bike on the deck outside my apartment when the weather's good. And the weather should be okay for most of spring semester.
That's true.
Well, your other option's to talk with Dr. Johnson. Maybe he'll give you permission to be 5 minutes late to his class because of the distance from your lab. Actually, I've had several classes with him, and he seems very approachable. Anyway, it's an alternative to the bike, if you don't want to do that.
Describe the woman's problem and the 2 suggestions that her friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the woman should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class. The professor is discussing the habitable zone.
Of course, stars are too hot to support life, but the light from a star warms orbiting planets or moons, supplying the energy needed for life to develop. Besides energy, a liquid, let's say a chemical solvent of some kind, is also necessary. On Earth, the solvent in which life developed was water. But others, such as ammonia, hydrogen fluoride, or methane, might also be appropriate. So, in order for the solvent to remain in liquid form, the planet or moon must lie within a certain range of distances from the star. Why is this so? Well, think about it. If the planet is too close to the star, the solvent will change into a gas, boiling and evaporating. If it's too far from the star, the solvent will freeze, transforming into a solid. For our sun and life as we know it, the habitable zone appears to lie between the orbits of Venus and Mars. Within this range, water remains liquid, and until recently, this area was indeed the accepted scientific definition of the habitable zone for our solar system. But now, scientists have postulated that the habitable zone may be larger than originally supposed. They speculate that the strong gravitational pull caused by larger planets may produce enough energy to heat the cores of orbiting moons. So, that means that these moons may support life. There may be habitable zones far beyond Venus.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the habitable zone, and then explain how the definition has been expanded by modern scientists.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Quiz. Speaking section. Example answers.
Question 1. Example answer.
The movie that's influenced my thinking the most is Fantasia, because it's my first memory of classical music and ballet. One reason the movie was so impressive is I was at a very impressionable age when I saw it, 5 years old. Besides that, it was made using the latest technology. In the 1950s, it was amazing to see detailed animation and hear high-quality sound, but what really influenced me was the music in the dance scenes. I especially remember Mickey Mouse dancing with the brooms, and I'm sure I took ballet lessons because of it. The coordination of the storm scene with the music from the Hall of the Mountain King still impresses me when I see it today, and thanks to Walt Disney, classical music is still my favorite music.
Question 2. Example answer.
I think it's good to evaluate teachers by their students' performance on standardized tests, because when teachers and students are judged by the same criteria, they'll work efficiently toward the same goals. Now, some teachers argue that tests aren't important, but still, students need good scores for admission to universities, so the tests are important to them. If teachers were evaluated on the same basis, then they'd pay more attention to the criteria on tests to design their lessons so both students and teachers would benefit. Another reason to use this evaluation is to compare teachers from different schools on a standardized scale. And this system would be more fair, too, because the possibility of a teacher getting a high evaluation because of friendship with the supervisor is also eliminated.
Question 3. Example answer.
The student said that he mostly agreed with the policy for in-state tuition, but he disagreed with a couple of requirements. For one thing, you can't use a campus address as a permanent address. But he's a dorm student, and he explained that he's lived in the dorm for 3 years because he's gone to school every summer without returning to his parents' home to live. So, the dorm really is his permanent address right now. He doesn't think he should have to use his parents' out-of-state address. Besides that, he hasn't been subsidized by his parents. In the policy, the most recent taxes must be filed in the state of residence, but he didn't make enough money to pay taxes. He didn't mention in which state he had his voter's registration or car registration and driver's licenses, but he said that he plans to continue living and working in the state after graduation, and he thought that he should be eligible for a waiver of the out-of-state fees.
Question 4. Example answer.
The experiment with kanji is important because it supports the theory that language should be acquired in natural settings instead of in a formal classroom. Previous research to teach primates to communicate included direct instruction in American Sign Language and also plastic shapes that could be arranged on a magnetic board. Earlier research, I think it was with Kanzi's mother, it replicated this formal approach. But when Kanzi learned vocabulary by observing the lessons, the direction of the experiment changed. In informal settings with trainers, Kanzi acquired a vocabulary of about 200 words and began to create sentences with words and gestures to communicate with human companions. Children of our own species learn by informal interaction with adults. The Kanzi experiment suggests that this may be a better way to teach language to primates.
Question 5. Example answer.
The problem is that the woman has only 15 minutes between classes, but it takes 20 minutes to walk from the chemistry lab to Hamilton Hall, where Professor Johnson's class is held. So she'd like to take the class with Johnson, but she'd be late. Her friend suggests that she buy a bike, but her concern is that she'd need a license and would have to store the bike somewhere at night. The other recommendation is to ask Dr. Johnson for permission to enter the class 5 minutes late. So I think the woman should talk with the professor first. Her friend says he's approachable, and he might give her permission to be late for class. The first 5 minutes in a class is usually just business anyway, taking attendance and handing back papers, so she wouldn't miss much. And if he refuses, then she can always resort to the other alternative. She can buy a bike and a license, and she can find a place to store it.
Question 6. Example answer.
The habitable zone's an area in which life can develop. There are several requirements, including an energy source and a chemical solvent that retains its liquid form. Okay, that means that the moon or the planet where life may develop has to be close enough to the energy source, probably a star, close enough that the solvent will remain a liquid. Outside the habitable zone, it would freeze or boil, depending on whether it was far away or too close to the star. In the case of Earth, the sun supplied the energy and water was the chemical solvent. So for life to evolve in ways similar to our own, the habitable zone would have to fall between Venus and Mars. But modern scientists are questioning whether the forces of gravity on larger planets might not generate enough energy to heat up the cores of the moons that orbit them. Now, if that's the case, then there could be habitable zones at a great distance from Venus, which was the previously determined limit for habitable zone in our solar system.
Review, Writing Section, Problem 31, Lecture.
Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage you have just read.
As you'll recall from the reading in your textbook, Freud's psychodynamic theory is premised on the assumption that dreams arise from a troubled subconscious mind, and so they have deep meaning. But there are other points of view that you should be familiar with. Alan Hobson and Robert McCarley propose a very different theory of dreams. They turn to biochemical research and physiology for answers, using data from their study of sleep activity in cats. And, by the way, they used cats because cats have brain waves and muscle movements during sleep that are very similar to those of humans. In any case, Hobson and McCarley determined that the kind of sleep associated with dreams is controlled from the brainstem, and furthermore, that there are chemicals in the stem that regulate the firing of certain neurons. So they posit that during dream sleep, brain cells that control movement and balance are activated, but the messages don't transfer to the body, and consequently, no movement's initiated. Still, the brain's trying to interpret the messages so dreams occur. But how does this explain what we dream about? I mean the content. Well, let's take the example of a common dream. Let's say you're trying to escape from something. The brain receives a message to run, but the legs don't respond. According to the activation synthesis theory, the dream that results will probably include something about being chased and running away. In other words, you'll play out the physical movement in a dream. But according to the proponents of the activation synthesis theory, there isn't any hidden meaning in your dream. Your unfulfilled desires have nothing to do with it. For the neurophysiologists, a dream's just a chemical response to brain cells.
Review, Writing Section, Problem 32, Lecture.
Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage you have just read.
Newer, high-speed computers have allowed us to perform experiments by modeling events that would be very difficult to duplicate under natural conditions. And we've been able to do some interesting research with models of the collapse of an interstellar cloud under the influence of its own gravitational pull. The modeling has led to a general consensus that stars form in that way, a process of collapse, I mean. So, although the experiments aren't definitive, they lead us to the logical conclusion that when a star is born, it will probably have a circumstellar nebula, with conditions that are very favorable to the formation of planets. In effect, we've been able to watch the conditions that existed at the beginning of the formation of the solar system and observe how the planets were formed, and that's pretty amazing. Furthermore, the modeling suggests that the planetary formation seems to be a natural consequence of the process that initiates the formation of a star. So, this suggests that planetary systems are the rule rather than the exception, and that means that an organized search for other planetary systems should yield some rather interesting results. We may find that the nebular hypothesis is valid not only for our solar system, but also for other systems in the universe. Besides that, when we do the math, we have to assume that at least some of the stars would produce solar systems with planets that could support life.
Quiz, Writing Section.
Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage you have just read.
Let me tell you about a case study that's often used as an example of how a win-win situation can be negotiated by both parties. Tony was a computer software designer who had come up with a great idea for a computer game. But his problem was that he couldn't afford to quit his job while he worked on the game because he had to make a living for his family. He thought it would probably take him about a year to actually complete the programming for the game if he worked in his spare time. Okay. Well, he put together a proposal and took it to a multinational company that had launched several successful computer games. But the problem was that the company made him a very low offer, just $1,000 a month for 12 months. And although that would have paid his bills during the time that he would have been working on the program, he knew that the game had a huge potential for return on the company's investment. So he felt like he would be taking all the risk without having the opportunity to share in the reward. But when the company refused to give him any additional upfront money, then instead of getting angry, Tony went back with a counteroffer. He agreed to accept the $12,000 as an advance on the profits that he expected the game to generate. And he suggested that they share the future revenues in a ratio of 40 to 60, 40% for Tony and 60% for the company. The company was interested, but explained to Tony that they would be investing over $1 million in order to produce and market the game, and would need a larger share in order to proceed. So they agreed on a 30-70 split. And as it happened, the game was a big success. The company made a huge profit, and Tony was able to quit his regular job and start his own game design company. So everybody won. They were both able to minimize their risk and increase their profits.